Hi, my name is Beth White, and I'm a manager in the offshore wind team at the Carbon Trust. I am the project manager of the Orgit Predictor project.
Hi, my name is Chris Thaxter. I'm a senior research ecologist with a BTO. I'm taking a lead role in the ornithological elements of the first work packages.
So today we're going to be presenting the Orgit Predictor project, which stands for the prevalence of seabird species and collision events in offshore wind farms. This first slide just gives an overview of the project, so you can see in the blue bubble that the overarching aim of the project is to develop a coordinated approach for reducing uncertainty surrounding bird collision risk and therefore reducing consenting risk at offshore wind farms. The project is being delivered by the Carbon Trust, BTO and Vardenberg Ecology, and there are 8 project partners that you can see under the aim there. Just to break down the objectives of the project in a bit more detail. So we're looking to create a growing database from existing bird collision risk studies, address research questions by applying a statistical framework to analyse these data sets, develop best practice guidance for data formats, requirements and processing, develop best practice guidance for installation of equipment, both integrated and retrofitted, provide recommended design drawings for installing equipment offshore, develop a roadmap to commercial use offshore for bird collision monitoring technology, and undertake due diligence assessments at shortlisted offshore wind farms to capture lessons learned. The project began in March 2024 and is expected to finish in February 2026. And the project is being supported by a project advisory group of 9 key stakeholders that are listed along the bottom of the slide there, with public funding coming from the Offshore Wind Evidence and Change Programme. So I'll now hand over to Chris to talk through the outputs of the first work package of the project that was led by BTO.
Thanks, Beth. So, as Beth said, the first work package is related to data requirements for bird collision risk monitoring. This work package has 3 main objectives, the first of which is to identify existing requirements for post-construction monitoring, which is PCM hereafter. And we think of this in a kind of schematic for a framework to data kind of workflow. So this first element really relates to identifying frameworks within different countries, what different motivations may exist, and how they may then impact on things like impact assessment and consenting decisions. The second objective relates to implemented and planned PCM studies, and with this comes with the first deliverable, which is to compile a library of reports on bird collision and avoidance. And this is drawing out things like metrics of interest, the species and taxa phases of the year, and of course that links through to the systems that are eventually chosen. And the third element is looking at data requirements for assessing collision risk. And this brings in things like study design and impacts on the data collected. And 2 additional deliverables, firstly to look at the data collection in relation to the outputs, and thirdly to look at the minimum data requirements to actually achieve the aims set out in those studies. So to do this, we've 3 different means of collecting the data. So we've looked at a literature review approach, and then we've got expert consultation, which is drawing on the partners and additional experts, and also then questionnaires and interviews with statutory bodies and regulators that have given us information for this first work package. So under the first objective, we found that requirements were very specific to country frameworks, and focusing on Germany, Netherlands and the UK, and looking at the phase of the study, equipment and the priority topics, we found, for example, that Germany is quite focused on migration, whereas the other countries, Netherlands and UK, are focused at all times of the year. The prescription for use of equipment also varied. So for Germany, for example, there's prescription of radar and camera technologies, whereas in the Netherlands there's some prescription, and in the UK it's rather case specific. In terms of priority topics, we've got cumulative impacts, mitigation and harmonisation of data that are important for Germany, but also in the Netherlands we've got a verification of EIA assumptions, and also in the UK, as shown by the question mark symbol, that's minimisation of uncertainty that came out as important. Under the second objective, this is the inventory for planned PCM studies. What we found was 49 studies, 37 wind farms and 11 countries had, for which we found reports or had data. And so this is shown by the date from the schematic on the left-hand side, where the dots show wind farm locations. So this is a range of camera technologies, radar technologies, other sensors that have been used, and environmental data sets, and a split of migration, breeding, or studies that compared both. And also various metrics that have been considered, things like collisions and collision rates, flight activity, that includes things like flight height and flight speed, different scales of avoidance and flux. In terms of the third objective, in terms of the data requirements, this is quite linked to the overall objectives of the study, so things like EIA validation, whether collisions or rates are needed, and that determines the data collections and the systems actually used. And we have to be mindful as well of the spatial sampling biases, things like the number of turbine years within each study, which is important to understand. And also in terms of the space use away from the distance across a transect. This schematic taken from a recent rescue report is basically the hypothetical dots within this parameter space are individual birds that could be detected. Birds outside of volume are not detected, but those inside, although detected, may have imperfect detection over increasing distance. So that factors into the denominator in the collision rate calculation, so important to understand that sort of detectability. And this is, of course, also influenced by things like the camera zoom, angle, and resolution, which may influence those sorts of decisions. So that's just to summarize, we've identified a number of studies with available data subject to sharing agreements, and do get in touch if you are interested in sharing data from existing studies. This is leading to two further work packages, the second of which is looking at data collection, which will assess sample sizes in more detail and formatting of data and exploratory investigations. And the third work package is the nuts and bolts of the study to develop a statistical framework to integrate data from studies through liaison with a statistical expert. And also then there's development of best practice and guidance. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Philip Ersupon from the British Trust for Ornithology, presenting some updates on the ORWEC Rescue project. RESCUE stands for Reducing Seabird Collisions Using Evidence, and this is an ORWEC-funded project that is led by Natural England and co-delivered by the British Trust for Ornithology, together with project partners and stakeholders from the sector. At the core of RESCUE, we're assessing how seabird distributions are monitored in 3 dimensions at sea. This is crucial to identify overlap with human infrastructure and to assess collision risks between seabirds and offshore wind developments. Flight height distributions are a key parameter in collision risk models, but accurately measuring seabird distributions at the relevant scales is not trivial. There are many monitoring approaches out there, but there's very little validation, and the performance metrics of most commercial tools are generally unavailable. We recently finished a comprehensive review of flight height monitoring methods, which is in press currently, and in that we distinguish the sampling characteristics for different monitoring technologies, focusing on the sampling and measurement characteristics of them. These characteristics interact and result in observed bird distributions that may not reflect the true flight height distribution of a species. In particular, we introduced this concept of a sampling geometry, which is the shape that an observer or sensor can actually sample. Within that sample volume then is the issue of detectability, so whether or not the bird that's present is actually picked up by the sensor. And lastly, once a bird is picked up and measured, the question is whether or not that measurement of flight height is accurate. We tried to experimentally gather some of these parameters for airborne digital imagery and LiDAR measurements during a field trial in August 2024. To that end, we deployed an experimental target array of plywood seabirds at Predannock Airfield in Cornwall. These target arrays were then surveyed by 2 commercial survey providers, and they produced this sort of imagery of the target arrays, as well as LiDAR point clouds of the arrays themselves. We generally found that detection rates are near perfect for large and light-colored targets, equivalent to the northern gannet, where 100% of the targets were recovered both in imagery and LiDAR measurements. But we found that for smaller bodied targets, so equivalent to kittiwake or storm petrel, and in particular dark colored targets, the detection rates dropped off both in the imagery and in the LiDAR measurements. When looking at the flight height measurements that were obtained, we generally found that LiDAR measurements were very precise and within 5 centimeters of the target height generally. And where we did find departures between the estimate and the true height, that was either linked to targets that were moving during the trial, shown here in the center, or small and dark targets that were either near the ground or where the LiDAR instrument picked up the tripod holding the target rather than the target itself. There were other activities happening during this field trial. We did further validations of imagery and LiDAR using moving drones. We deployed animal-borne GPS tags on the drones to validate those, and we did experimental work to validate laser rangefinder accuracy and sampling characteristics. Importantly, the field program also contained 2 offshore DAS LiDAR surveys near the Flamborough and Filey Coast SPA in autumn 2024. During those, about 2,000 detections of free-flying seabirds were collected in imagery and LiDAR, as well as LiDAR data on the instantaneous sea surface heights and atmospheric noise across the sampled volume. In summary, our methods review identified a lack of robust analytical procedures in determining imperfect sampling and measurement in flight height determinations. The field trial delivered experimental data on LiDAR performance, and we generally found that height measurements from LiDAR are very accurate, within 5 centimeters typically. But we also found that detection overall is not perfect, in particular for smaller bodied seabirds and dark colored seabirds. Imperfect detection needs to be considered. Lots of analysis are still ongoing, including the imagery data from the onshore field trial, the telemetry data and the laser rangefinder data, as well as the offshore data overall. There are additional offshore DAS LiDAR surveys planning process for the coming years. Besides those trial outputs, Rescue has a exciting work program where we're planning to also release flight height analysis tools and a retrospective synthesis of existing flight height data, as well as best practice recommendations for future monitoring of seabird flight heights. Thank you very much.
Hello. This is a short overview of the project MetaKitty, which stands for modeling of kittiwake metapopulation dynamics. So the project had 2 objectives. The obvious one, which was to look at how we could tease apart particular vulnerabilities in the demography and colony by colony dynamics of the reasonably threatened kittiwake metapopulation around the British Isles. The broader agenda for the project was to use the kittiwakes as a case study, as a testbed for developing the next generation of population viability analysis that could be applied to all seabird species and potentially any other colonial species of interest. So a next generation PVA is actually quite a tall order in terms of the features that we're expecting it to include. So these are the sort of the collection of features in the MetaKitty project modeling that we've undertaken, and I've highlighted in red those features that don't usually customarily exist in PVA analysis carried out for seabirds at large. So the project incorporates the collection of data on population counts, adult survival, breeding success, natal dispersal, and any circumstantial or anecdotal expert opinions that might be available around the species, and looks to incorporate all of these data in integrated modeling by simultaneously modeling the dynamics of the detailed network of all colonies, in this case 89 in total, of which 33 were SPAs. The model, as is usually the case with PVA analysis of this sort, was age-structured, but crucially, unlike most of the analyses in this area, allowed for a distinction between breeding birds and floating birds. This is quite a crucial class of birds that comprises either subadult recruits or birds that are sabbaticals or have opted not to breed, which can act as a buffer for the population under times of crisis, and are therefore quite a crucial class to include. The reason these classes haven't really been distinguished is because it's generally very difficult to count floating birds. They're a latent variable essentially, so an integrated approach of the type presented here is required in order to estimate them. Other features included in the model are three types of density dependence, all of which are generally ignored in typical PVAs. So in addition to the standard compensatory density dependence, which is effectively crowding at colonies, we also have two additional types. Depensatory density dependence, or Lee effects, the difficulty of a colony to establish when it's really small, and density dependence indirectly through prey depletion of breeding birds at sea. All of these things are included as features, and their strength is estimated directly from the data. In addition, we have two types of connectivity, so the colonies are not being looked at in isolation. So we looked at connectivity through donations between colonies via natal dispersal, but also indirect connectivity through prey depletion and at-sea competition, which introduces an indirect, if you like, linkage between neighboring colonies. Finally, the model was not just parameterized, it was fitted to the entirety of the data, which allowed us full treatment of stochasticity and uncertainty to be propagated through to any predictions made out of the model. On the left here, you see the specific locations of SPA and non-SPA colonies which constituted the network in the modeling. The model itself contained three state variables, three classes of birds: breeders, juveniles, and floaters. These were connected by demographic processes such as recruitment of floaters into breeders, maturation of juveniles from chicks to candidate recruits, and so on and so forth. All of these processes and classes could be affected by different modulating factors like external covariates or connectivity, density dependence of different types, and you can see here where these processes were allowed to intervene. I will cut to the results straight away. So having fitted the model to the collection of all demographic and population count data, we were able to essentially reconstruct the dynamics with uncertainty of each individual colony. So only 8 of those are shown here as an illustration of the 89. And combining the results of all of these colonies was able to give us a description of the general trends in population dynamics. Here's a comparison between SPA and non-SPA colonies, showing a very interesting recent decline in SPA colonies in particular, but also indicating the large amounts of uncertainty in the credible intervals shown in this plot. Another product of this model is the final colony status reconstruction. So for each colony, we're able to get its estimated size with the occasionally very large credible intervals, the estimated carrying capacity of the colony with, again, some even larger credible intervals for particular colonies, and the proportion of recruitment that each colony is contributing to the entire population at any given time. These are all snapshots for the most recent year in the time series. We can also decompose the demographic components into survival and breeding success. Here, seeing a complete reconstruction of the entire metapopulation's demographic processes. These plots can be produced for any colony of interest individually. On the right, there's a distinction between the scales of codependence between colonies. So in green, We see the spatial scale of resource competition between colonies for prey. It's a fairly fine scale process, as opposed to the much larger scale connectivity between colonies resulting from natal dispersal and recruitment contributions between them. So the dashed lines indicate the half distances at which, for example, recruitment contributions drop to 50% as a function of distance. The spatially explicit nature of the modeling also allows us to look at how the colonies might interact in space. So this is quite an information-rich plot here, which shows in pink the initial sizes of individual colonies, in green the current sizes estimated of individual colonies, and in orange the strongest connections, linkages between neighboring colonies. In this case, arbitrarily selected to be the top 3% of connectivity due to natal dispersal. Finally, some next steps. The project's only halfway through its life. We're going to look at much more depth at the source sync dynamics prevailing in the network. We're going to generate prediction scenarios. We're going to produce PVA code that can be more broadly used beyond kittiwakes. And we're going to make a start, at least, on thinking about covariates of the decline and how to incorporate them into the modeling. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone, I'm Adam Butler from Biomathematics and Statistics Scotland, and I'll be talking today about the ORGIP Assess project, assessing the extent and significance of uncertainty in offshore wind assessments. And I'm representing a broad project consortium here, representing BIOS, MacArthur Green, James Hutton Institute, UK Centre for Ecology, Hydrology, and University of St Andrews. This project's motivated by an urgent need to quantify current levels of uncertainty across the assessment process and sensitivities of estimated impacts to different sources of uncertainty, and also by a related need to improve through stakeholder engagement, ways in which information on uncertainty then translated through into decision making in the context of a precautionary approach. And the idea is that the different elements of work within the project will then feed into recommendations for future research and for improved treatment of uncertainty within the assessment process. The project involves 4 different work packages, and I'll talk about each of these in detail and then how they link to each other. And it's also underpinned by an independent review. The first work package focuses on a review of existing knowledge, beginning by a review of the methods and tools that are commonly used in practice within assessments and the SNCB guidance associated with the use of these approaches. This then feeds into a larger review of evidence around the key input parameters used in tools and the estimates and associated with those. And in looking at uncertainty, this considers both the different ways in which uncertainty is measured and summarized, for example, through standard errors, confidence intervals, ranges, and also qualitative sources of uncertainty. So, for example, around different sources of evidence and the extent to which that evidence is transferable between different contexts, for example, from land to the marine environment or between different countries, and also around qualitative source of uncertainty to do with the structure of models and uncertainties associated with that. So, for example, whether density dependence or density independence are assumed within population models. So the other part of the first work package beyond that review is then an update of the roadmap around research priorities to reduce and improve quantification of uncertainty that was originally produced by Searle et al., originally as part of a JNCC funded project and then extended into a paper. And within this project, we produced a draft update of this roadmap, focusing on a review of research activities that have been underway since the original report was published to address priorities identified within the roadmap. As part of the draft update of the roadmap, we've also identified some newly emerging research priorities around 3 topics: impacts of external shocks, quantifying turnover of seabirds observed at sea, and seabird diet outside the chick rearing period. And we then identified potential priorities for research associated with those. The second work package involves sensitivity analysis. Sensitivity analysis is a general statistical framework for looking at how sensitive key outputs from models are to both variation and uncertainty in the inputs to those models, and also to the assumptions and structures that underpin models. And the idea is that the first element of this will be looking at sensitivity of key outputs to assessment tools in relation to uncertainties in the parameters going into those tools, and using that to help underpin and facilitate the stakeholder engagement activities taking place in the next work package. There's then a second element of the sensitivity analysis using a more systems-based approach to investigate three key themes around correlations between parameters both within and between tools, and also around the separation between parameter uncertainty and systematic stochasticity. Just to show the kinds of outputs that we are producing in the first element of the sensitivity analysis, emphasizing this is just an illustrative example, we show here how changing away from a particular reference source to other potential sources of information changes both the estimates and uncertainty associated with impacts. And we're focusing here on a particular key output metric produced by population viability analysis, the ratio of impacted to unimpacted final population size at the end of 30 years of operation. But we also look at other output metrics commonly used in practice, and we look at changing between different sources of information and varying parameters by fixed amounts, and looking at various qualitative changes to the inputs to models. The third work package goes on to look at applying precaution in relation to uncertainty and focuses on stakeholder engagement. There are two elements to this. A stakeholder workshop around precaution and uncertainty took place in early December, focusing on four key questions. Which approaches to the treatment of uncertainty have been considered in assessments to date? To what extent is it desirable to change the way uncertainty is treated within the context of assessments, and why? The extent to which requirement for precaution provides a barrier to alternative approaches, and any other barriers that exist to the use of alternative approaches to the treatment of uncertainty. This was then used to frame follow-up stakeholder engagement to explore key themes identified by the workshop in rather more detail, especially around potential solutions to the barriers identified by the workshop. Just to focus on one of the key barriers that the workshop identified was around the fact that the project level focus of the existing way that uncertainty is brought into assessments often provides major constraints on what's possible and provides challenges around timelines and so forth. And so there was much discussion around the potential for moving more consideration of uncertainties to the plan level in order to overcome some of those challenges. And the follow-up stakeholder engagement will explore that issue further. All of these elements of work then feed through into the production of recommendations about both around prioritisation of future research and data collection, and also around the potential for improving the treatment of uncertainty within the assessment process, building heavily on the stakeholder engagement activities. And this will in particular focus not just on longer term solutions, but also on identifying immediate specific solutions that could be implemented in the short term. The intended outcomes of the work are to develop an approach to evaluation and communication of uncertainty, that the approach and recommendations developed use a structured process of stakeholder engagement in order to maximise dissemination and ensure uptake, and crucially to identify realistic improvements in the way uncertainty is handled in assessments that can facilitate a reduction in delays and timelines for consenting. Thank you very much for listening.